Hello everybody, my name is Ethan and I am a CFI in training. It's been a little while since I was doing my CFI training and it's going to be a little while until I take my check ride, so let's see if I still got it. Today in this video we're going to be talking about human factors. This is Task H from the Private Pilot's License ACS, Airman Certification Standards, and in the previous videos we have talked through A through E, and we also talked about optical illusions. And in today's video, we're just going to be talking about carbon monoxide poisoning, stress and fatigue, dehydration and nutrition, hypothermia, dissolved nitrogen in the bloodstream after scuba dives. And we're also going to talk a little bit about alcohol and drugs and those types of things, because it can get a little bit tricky when you have over-the-counter medications added into that, because whenever you see alcohol and drugs, you just think like illegal drugs, but they can also trip you up if you're taking certain over-the-counter medications. So the first thing that we will discuss is carbon monoxide poisoning. So as we've talked about in previous videos, carbon monoxide poisoning deals from us inhaling carbon monoxide gas. So it's a little bit tricky because carbon monoxide gas is actually a odorless gas. Like we don't know that it's there if it is there. And one very common thing that we'll learn is that if you are smelling, exhaust fumes or things like that, that's oftentimes a possibility that, hey, I could be getting carbon monoxide poisoning right now. But other than that, there's no real way to tell that it's happening other than feeling the symptoms. So what we typically associate it with is if we have some sort of exhaust leak, like if there's a crack in our exhaust pipe or anything like that, we could have that crack causing the exhaust gases to go into our heat shroud, which is actually a thing that we run the engine air, or we run air around the exhaust heat shroud, which then goes into our cockpit if we're trying to heat the cockpit at, during the winter time or anything like that. So that can become an issue then if we're using heating or anything like that. So as far as the symptoms goes, we have headache, blurred vision, dizziness, numbness, and tingling. And then as far as the fixes go, we have a couple of things that we want to do. We can turn off that heat if we know that that heat could possibly be causing it. That's one thing. If we open our vents and windows, that would be another thing. We could get some fresh air in so that we're not just breathing that. Use supplemental oxygen if we have it. And then we just want to land as soon as possible. If I realize that I have carbon monoxide poisoning, I'm probably going to want to do an emergency descent or just get back to a landing as fast as possible. And then if you suspect that, it's smart to go see a doctor, because carbon monoxide can take about 48 hours to get out of your system. So and it also can cause other issues. So it's just important to visit a doctor after that. Get checked up. Just make sure that you're okay, because again, we don't want to run into more problems afterwards. So just remembering with carbon monoxide poisoning, we also know that it can cause some types of hypoxia as well. It can cause our hypemic hypoxia. So just realizing that if that happens, it's no good. We want to be able to fix that through the different avenues that I just listed. But remembering that it is colorless and odorless is very important. But also remembering that a very normal way and most common with aviation is that we may smell it if we smell exhaust gases in the cockpit, because that could mean that the heat that is pouring into our cockpit is also being mixed with the exhaust gases. So the next thing that we have is stress and fatigue. And with that, we mainly want to concern ourselves with two different types of each, which is acute and chronic. So when it comes to stress, we always have a certain amount of stress, especially during flight training. And with stress, we have like an automatic response. If I have, acute stress, that's just something happened and I am now locked in. I've got heightened response time. I've got automatic responses that I'm doing, and most of it is just, it's just automatic. It's by instinct, and I have a heightened response to stimuli. I'm more focused, everything like that. But then when I get into chronic stress, then I have a lot more stress than my body can handle, because a certain amount of stress is good for you, but when it becomes too much, it can become a huge burden on you and drastically decrease your performance. So with that, it's just important to recognize that, a lot of flight training happens in when you're in high school or in college. And if I have a lot of tests coming up or anything like that, and I just can tell that I'm stressed when I'm not flying, maybe it's smart to not go fly, because that could then cause me some issues, or just overall make a flight not very um, profitable for me, because flight training is very expensive. Um, then acute fatigue is just essentially us getting tired from periods of physical or mental strain. So if I go into a flight and I've just been really focused for a really long time and it's really new to me, I could become acutely fatigued. Or let's say I go and I fly for an hour and a half and it's the bumpiest flight I've ever been on, I will become fatigued. Or if I have less than a regular night's sleep, I would also be acutely fatigued. And what you can do with that is just giving yourself time to rest. You can give yourself the time to get more sleep, get an 8 hours nights of sleep, or maybe just don't try and keep flying. Don't try and keep stressing, or not stressing, but tiring yourself out. Then chronic fatigue is long periods of bad sleep or long periods of physical or mental strain without proper recovery, but it's also typically partnered with some sort of psychological condition, like my dog died, or I'm really struggling with money, or anything like that. Like, those stresses can add on to that fatigue and make your symptoms of your fatigue, which is just errors in timing, shortened reaction time, or less reaction time, that kind of stuff. If I have chronic fatigue, my deterioration of my skills and my abilities will just fall really rapidly without any fix, unless if I were to attack whatever that issue was. So if it was, that my dog died, maybe grieving through that, or whatever it may be. So dehydration and nutrition is our next topic, and there's not really too much to know with these. I mean, everybody knows what happens when you're dehydrated. You become extremely tired, or if you're malnourished, you're also going to become extremely tired, have cramps or dizziness, headache, that kind of stuff. And dehydration is essentially just we don't have enough water in our body for our body to utilize to function correctly. So what's important with dehydration is we just want to make sure that we're drinking enough water and staying away, especially in excessive heat. If it's hot in the summertime, it's hot in the plains, staying away from diuretic drinks like coffee or tea or alcohol, things like that, is very important, because those take away some of that water from our body. So it's important to just remember to drink a lot with dehydration, especially in the summertime. Overdrink if you have to. And as far as nutrition goes, we also just want to eat balanced meals. It's very easy as a pilot, if I want to go and sit at the airport. If I want to sit at the airport, I can go and just, maybe not bring myself any meals or anything like that. And that really does weigh on you, and it can heavily decrease your performance. So it's just important to, maybe don't always rely on that vending machine or rely on just a few snacks throughout the day. Like, bring yourself at least a meal so that you can be energized. Your body can be working through that nutritional value and perform well because of it. So hypothermia is something that we focus on, especially in cold times, because it is extremely cold, and it can be in aircraft, especially during the wintertime. And what we want to concern ourselves with hypothermia is mainly we want to dress to egress. So if I'm going to fly, you never know when you could have an engine failure and be stranded for a little while in the middle of nowhere. So dress with a coat, with hat, gloves, hand warmers if you need them, maybe a couple of snacks. That's always important to have, just in case. And that's just mainly what we want to focus on, because everybody has seen hypothermia before. At first you're just feeling cold, you're shivering, you have goosebumps, and then people in later stages can become really confused or feel like their body is burning up or things like that. So it's just important to not even get to these early stages of hypothermia. We just want to make sure that we are dressing to egress. So, dissolved nitrogen. This specifically happens, a lot of pilots really like to, for some reason. Pilots really love to go scuba diving. That's just people really love to go, if you're a pilot, you love to go real high and you love to go real low for some reason. But you can get, if you've ever heard of what's called the bends, which is decompression sickness. So as we go deep down into high pressure, if you got a lot of water pushing down on you, as you go deep down into that, the nitrogen that's in our body dissolves. It dissolves into our tissues and fluids. Then, as we start to come up and we get introduced to a lower pressure, like pressure at the surface, that solution of where it dissolved into our body, it then comes out of that solution and can form bubbles. And if those bubbles form in our tissues or in our joints or things like that, they are extremely painful. And that is what's called the bends. So what that is it can be milder excruciating joint pain, as well as it just depends on where the nitrogen is in this solution in our body because it can be all over the place. So as far as that goes, and this just becomes a little bit confusing, the FAA recommends that if you're going up to 8,000 feet, so if I'm either from the surface up to 8,000 feet and planning on flying after having done a scuba dive, if I did what's called a uncontrolled ascent, which means I went down but not super far to where I had to like stop halfway up or in sections on the way up to let myself equalize. If I did an uncontrolled ascent, didn't go too awful far, I only need 12 hours. So if I scuba dove, I give myself 12 hours after that, then I can fly as long as I'm capping myself out at 8,000 feet. Then if I do what's a controlled ascent, which means I went to a really far depth down in the ocean and I had to equalize slowly as I came back up, then I need to wait 24 hours. And then if I'm at altitudes above 8,000 feet, I want to wait 24 hours regardless. And honestly, like, there's no purpose in sitting there and coming up with the decision that, well, I only did a uncontrolled ascent, so I only need to wait 12 hours. Like, you just should probably give yourself a higher margin for error just because you don't want to run into an issue there. And then here's an important thing. If you ever encounter the bends in flight, if you see that somebody's just in excruciating pain, you can give them an oxygen mask, turn it to 100% oxygen if that is something that you have. You do an emergency descent, you want to land as soon as possible, and you want to seek medical attention because it can end up really bad really quickly with the bends. Lastly, we're going to talk about alcohol and drugs. So with alcohol and drugs, the important thing is just to realize that if you're ever drinking alcohol or if you're ever doing drugs, you don't want to fly. Like, we already know it's not good to drink and drive. It's even worse to drink and fly. We do have it pretty well laid out in 9117 right here, covering alcohol or drugs. This is one regulation that we're going to want to remember for our private pilot check ride. And the rule is 8 hours bottle to throttle. So if I have drank alcohol, I want to wait at least 8 hours before I drink alcohol to then flying. As well as I can't operate or act as the crew member of a civil aircraft when under the influence of alcohol. So you may wonder, what does that mean? That is the FAA's way of saying, it doesn't matter how much, if you have any alcohol in your system and you end up in an accident or anything like that, they are able to then make you liable for that reason, for you being under the influence. And then we also have, if you have an alcohol concentration or a BAC, blood alcohol concentration of 0.04 or greater, then you should not be flying. And with driving, I believe it's 0.08. So, it's a little tighter with aviation, but it tracks. As well as while using any drug that affects a person's faculties in any way contrary to safety. So, again, any drug. And when I think of drugs, I think of, weed or the illegal drugs, cocaine, things like that. But the FAA does not just mean that. So that's where we can go into what I like to look up. If I ever get any new over-the-counter medication from the doctor or anything like that, you can go to and just look up on Google FAA no-fly medications list. And the FAA has a lot of publications that just say these are things that you cannot do and fly. So they make your medical invalid if you are under the influence of these. And it's just important to go through this. Anytime you get a new drug, just make sure that it's not on this list. This is one for over-the-counter medications. And you can also always contact your designated pilot examiner if you're taking a new medication. Just ask them. Make sure, hey, is this good? Am I good to fly still? Because that does make your medical invalid. And that's where we can then talk about 6153. And it says, no person who holds a medical certificate issued under Part 67 may act as pilot in command or in any other capacity as required pilot flight crew member while that person, and this is what we're concerned with, is taking medication or receiving other treatment for a medical condition that results in the person being unable to meet the requirements for the medical certificate necessary for the pilot operation. So we want to concern ourselves with that. Just make sure that we are airworthy to fly. Make sure that I personally, we do the I am safe checklist. Just making sure, hey, are my medications part of that no-fly medication list? Anything like that. Because that is something that becomes important. And especially if you were to get into an accident or incident and the FAA discovered that when they were doing their investigation, that could end up poorly for you, and it's just a safety issue, not even an issue of whether or not I get in trouble. It's just a safety issue. So that is alcohol and drugs. So in this video, we covered the rest of human factors, and we went through the symptoms, we went through the fixes, and we talked a little bit about some of our regulations that we are wanting to concern ourselves with. And thank you so much for watching.